Welcome everyone. I'm excited to welcome everyone back after lunch to the exciting jobs panel. We'll start in just a minute. I know we all had a very healthy, high-protein lunch, so we won't be nodding off at all. But my colleagues here have promised to be very exciting and snappy, they said. So we will do that. Before we jump into the panel, I'd like to point out, I think we all had lots of good protein, at least a half a cup of vegetables, yes, which is all right. I'd like to take this moment to say thank you to the fabulous hotel staff that has been doing such a great job of taking care of us. So I know you're probably not all in the room now, but we thank you for your great work. Also, before we start, I've been asked to clarify that the bill that the senator was talking about is the Water Resources Development Bill, also known as WRDA. And that's what she's asking us all to call our representatives about. Also say that you're calling about the end of the year spending bill. So I'm glad to see everyone taking notes and looking forward to seeing you take action on that after our panel at the next break. So we're here today to talk about workforce and infrastructure. I'd like to introduce myself and the team up here. My name's Nevin. I work at a nonprofit based in Chicago in the Midwest, and we do energy efficiency, lead hazard remediation, and address other environmental and health and safety hazards in low-income residential housing. We have with us Dwayne Spencer, who's President and CEO of Habitat for Humanity of Greater Memphis. He's now working in existing housing and encountering lots of on-the-ground issues with regard to lead hazards, and he'll talk more about that. Next to him, we have Sam Schaefer, who's CEO of Center for Employment Opportunities. He's CEO of CEO.
That's my one joke.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't believe you, though. I think you have others. And his organization provides transitional employment for men and women returning home from prison in 19 sites across the United States. So we're excited to hear about more from him. Mike Wilson is the Director of National Health Initiatives of the BlueGreen Alliance, a national coalition of labor unions and environmental organizations working on issues that affect people and the planet. And then we have Nevin. Rick is a senior economist at ICF. He's not new to this issue at all. He did the economic analysis on the 2000 federal strategy to eliminate childhood lead poisoning. He's also author of Lucifer Curves, The Legacy of Lead Poisoning, a book about the global relationship between lead exposure and crime. So let's welcome the panelists. And let's start out with you.
Yeah.
Can you tell us, like from a national perspective, what are we talking about here in terms of jobs?
I should back up a little bit, though, and say I know you've heard about window replacement from a couple of other speakers. I hope you're on board with that subject because I'm passionate about it, so you're going to have to hear a little bit more. Working on the 2000 federal strategy to eliminate childhood lead poisoning, we developed a model that forecast lead paint hazard and elevated blood lead risk, and it was really based on housing demolition and window replacement rates, plus the impact of HUD regulations. That model has proven to be very accurate in forecasting ongoing declines in lead paint hazards and ongoing declines in children with elevated blood lead levels in pre-1960 housing in particular. And this is really important because after the phase-out of leaded gasoline, a lot of people thought we weren't going to make any more progress. And there's been a lot of grantees activity, a lot of other efforts and regulations, but they just said this isn't going to be enough. The good news is that we have a powerful market force working with us. And the reason why window replacement is such a key factor in reducing lead exposure trends, Dave Jacobs mentioned this earlier, is that they have the highest levels of lead in paint. Window troughs often have lead paint chips in them, and the friction surfaces create lead dust hazards in homes that have absolutely no deteriorated lead paint. I've described old windows as like a perpetual lead dust machine. The other thing that's important to know is that those old hazardous windows have single pane glass, which is horribly energy inefficient. And the reason that single pane glass is a very good indicator of these are the original windows, and they probably are almost certainly, in the case of pre-1940 housing, have lead paint, is double pane windows and more efficient windows after that became common about the time that lead paint was banned. So if you go in an older home, you say, oh, they've got double pane windows, they already replaced the original windows with lead paint, is what that almost certainly means. Now, and what this means is when you replace the old single pane windows, you get an enormous benefit in terms of energy efficiency, energy savings, and we've talked some about the problem that the housing market doesn't really value lead safe homes the way it should. Well, the one qualifier to that statement is that there is a very clear value that's been tracked by Remodeling Magazine with resale values showing that recently replaced windows is a big selling point and does add significantly to home value. Now, we can't ignore other lead paint hazards, obviously, but a simple home upgrade that replaces all the single pane windows and repairs any deteriorated paint, cleans up properly, and then does clearance testing to make sure that you don't have any lead dust hazards. That simple four-step upgrade seems to effectively eliminate the risk of lead dust and lead paint hazards in a home based on a 12-year follow-up study of homes where those four actions had been taken. So the lead-safe window replacement strategy was recently applied to 466 housing units over a couple of years through the Illinois Comprehensive Lead Education Reduction and Window Replacement Program, also known as the Clear Win Program, one of the best acronyms ever. And that pilot program showed a few really promising things. First, it showed that this strategy can achieve a large reduction in window costs through bulk purchases. Dave and I, with some other colleagues, have published studies on the net benefits of lead-safe window replacement. We were basing that and clearly showing net benefits from lead hazard reduction, increased home value, and energy savings, clearly showing net benefits based on the retail cost of window replacement. But if we're looking at trying to do something on a large scale with some kind of government support or encouragement, a programmatic effort, the Illinois program showed you get huge savings, even buying the highest efficiency Energy Star windows when you're buying in bulk. And the other thing the program showed is that scaling to a national level would really create substantial job creation. To be specific, you've heard this number before, there's a little over 1.2 million pre-1960 housing units with single pane windows and resident children under the age of 6. And providing lead-safe window replacement in all of those units would create about 75,000 one-year full-time equivalent jobs. You could spread that over, 3 to 5 years, whatever you thought was manageable. But it's important to note that the Clearwind data show that about 27% of those jobs were in window manufacturing. About 51% were for window installation contractors. 22% was local administrative jobs. That would include the cost of the government staff that went and did the lead dust testing to have independent tests. And because this was a study, the maintenance of all the data for the study. So in terms of scaling up and whether we're dealing with any kind of a serious problem and how quickly we could address this, there's no reason that I can imagine why window manufacturers would have any problem meeting this demand. They would be thrilled because although we've seen some recovery in a lot of areas of the economy, new home starts are still at historically low levels. So, and it's worth noting also, I've talked to window manufacturers and they say, if your launching a program that requires the highest efficiency Energy Star windows. That's sort of that's also a way of saying it has to be American made, because they said the really high efficiency windows are made in the United States, even though they're facing some competition for what they call much lower quality and less efficient windows, but they wouldn't satisfy the Energy Star rating. So clearly we could get the window manufacturers ramped up. And the other thing the Clearwind program did is that they did the work both with licensed lead hazard abatement contractors and just general contractors who would receive the RRP training. And their basic conclusion was that they did about just as well. So we're in a situation where we can clearly ramp up with contractors and we can ramp up with window manufacturers. There are a lot of tough issues to solve in lead poisoning, but this is one where we don't have to find it. I feel like we've already done a lot of work, and we know if it's a pre-1960 home with single pane windows, there's a really good chance that there are lead dust hazards in that home. The windows are contributing to it, even if you don't see any deteriorated paint. And we can tackle this problem. I don't think there's any reason why. It's just a matter of getting the financial support for it. And it's worth noting that we could encourage a much broader coalition to support this by emphasizing the massive impact it would have on energy efficiency, associated emissions, revitalization of neighborhoods because of the increase in home value that it provides. So I'm a little bit passionate on this subject, if you haven't noticed.
Well, thank you. So you paint a very bright and optimistic picture, which I think we all need. Need these days. And just, I guess we have an electronic way to do this, but show of hands, who's now convinced that we need to focus on single pane windows? I know I am. Great. If you haven't, Rick is going to seek you out and find you. So now, let's ask Dwayne to talk about what is it really like on the ground in Memphis renovating existing low-income housing.
Yep. Thanks for allowing me to be here. I love being in the room with all these smart people. Because
you're one of us.
So Habitat for Humanity typically builds houses from the ground up, and that's what we've been doing for more than 30 years. But a few years ago, we decided to move into the area of revitalization. Obviously, living in an urban area, there's that great need. So we started doing rehabs and refurbishments, critical repairs, and that is where we started to identify some of the supplemental needs that families were facing in their homes. In particular, we are in the middle of a pretty significant aging in place initiative. We got $6 million from a couple of different major sources, and we will have served about 350 seniors by the end of this calendar year. So what our folks do, they go out and do a scope of work. There's a construction worker, a social worker, and another person taking pictures and keeping up with the conversation with the senior. But we're identifying all of the supplemental needs that the senior is facing, like food malnutrition and maybe someone's abusing them, taking advantage of them, but also the other physical issues that they're facing in the home. So had we not gone into the home of the senior intentionally trying to help them age in place, we wouldn't be identifying the other tertiary issues like lead. So obviously the seniors' homes that were built before 1978 or have small children in them, we are referring them to our local lead department. The city of Memphis has a lead program that's been in place since 1995. They've gotten about $23 million from HUD and done about 1,600 interventions. However, our local health department says that in a 2-year period, 2012 to 2013, we had about 1,000 cases of childhood lead poisoning. So 1,000 cases in 2 years versus 1,600 remediations since 1995. So obviously something's wrong with the math. Obviously, if there was money for remediation, we could have a greater impact. We know that the dollars from HUD have a lot of regulations and compliance, and according to the folks at our local housing and community development, that is the biggest struggle with workforce creation, is that after they've sent folks through the training, they're using the same dollars to pay them through subsequent lead program funding. And the regulations and the compliance is one of the problems. When our contractors go out and do work, when you do government work, usually you do the work and then you get a drawdown. And we're talking about small minority and women-owned businesses who really just can't carry the cost of that. And so we end up finding ourselves, as a Habitat affiliate, hiring folks out and needing to pay them before we even get our dollars from the federal government. So I think one of the ways that we could certainly create workforce is, as Rick pointed out, a multitude of interventions and working across, multi-sector.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
That's great information. So in addition to being the jobs panel, I think I'm going to also call us the Nexus panel, because Rick mentioned the value of combining lead and energy in order to drive large number of jobs. And Dwayne talked about aging in place, which is a big movement now, and how that and other housing programs can also drive lead remediation and create huge workforce opportunities. So now I'm going to ask Sam. I'm sorry about taking your joke. I really am.
It's all I had.
I don't believe that. Tell us about men and women who are returning from prison and how we get them to work.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me here, and thanks so much for being on this panel. It really is great to be part of one of these Nexus panels in which we're talking about the intersection of the critical infrastructure work that has to happen around this country and the critical workforce development work. I spend a lot of time in rooms talking to workforce development professionals, talking to criminal justice professionals, talking about how we should be in rooms like this. How men and women coming home from prison should be part of the solution of rebuilding America. Just to pull the camera back in some of the context generally, there's 2.2 million people who are currently incarcerated in the United States, about 200,000 in federal prison, a few hundred thousand in immigration detention, 700,000 in local jails, and 1.3 million people in state prisons. Every year from those state prisons, about 600,000, 615,000 will be released back to communities. And if you're going to map the density of those returning citizens and properties that had lead poisoning and lead hazards, you'd see almost a one-to-one match, right? And so men and women who are at a high risk of returning to prison are coming back into communities that have this tremendous infrastructure need. I don't want to be Pollyannish about the barriers and how hard this is. CEO is an employment reentry provider working, not yet 19 cities, it's only 13. We're on our way, but in New York, California, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, hopefully soon Colorado, Ohio, and Texas, we're focusing on recently released men and women, people who are coming home within the first 90 days, who are what we call high risk. And what does high risk look like? High risk means reading at an 8th grade level. Numeracy skills far below that, probably more in the 6th or 7th grade level. Half of the people we've worked with in this tracks across the former prisoner population have never worked before. And so while I do want to raise my hand and say, yes, these 75,000 jobs, how do we make this match? It's really the beginning of a pathway to help former prisoners enter into these domains. And so the numbers are big, they can be sometimes intimidating, but there really are ways to wrap our arms around this. CEO's first office outside of New York City was in Buffalo, New York. Buffalo has 1,000 returning citizens. They come from just a handful of zip codes. Buffalo has a serious lead hazard issue, but it also has a serious commitment to addressing that issue. It was not possible for us to simply take men and women who had never worked before, didn't have OSHA 10 certificates, didn't have the proper training directly onto these sites, but it was possible to get them aware of what the opportunities career-wise was. So CEO's approach is we recruit people, we put them through a very brief life skills education class, and then we put them to work for us on our social enterprise. The social enterprise, which pays daily, which gives them supervision, which leads to a full-time job, I'm not sure it's appropriate that they're doing the window replacement, but they can be on the construction site. They can be laborers. They can be getting the stackable credentials they need that could ultimately lead to a career in green energy, in lead hazard abatements. The power of this is so real. Men and women coming home to their communities, when they step onto a work site that's helping remediate a home. We've done work with Habitat for Humanity doing home rebuilding in Oklahoma City, in Buffalo, and a few other places. They immediately understand the impact of what they're doing, that they're giving the home to a neighbor, they're giving a home to someone might be just like themselves, who really need that safe, affordable place to live. So I do think, again, there's this great opportunity for alignment. We do need to begin really, and potentially it's a place to begin in certain states, behind the walls, right? Getting people interested in this as a career, but recognizing that it's going to take a handful of steps to get there.
Great, thank you. That's a great summary. So Mike, tell us about high road agreements and how we can make sure these are good jobs and workers can really benefit.
Yeah, so I guess I'll sort of pick it up from there, and also from what something that Dr. Landerman said this morning, and that is that when we're talking about lead remediation work and infrastructure work, we really are talking about construction, and we're talking about labor, scraping, sanding, carpentry work, working at heights, working in trenches, plumbing and pipe fitting work, and so forth. And the fact is that we have a construction fatality problem in the United States. The construction workforce makes up about 7% of the American workforce, but they suffer between 20 and 25% of the on-the-job traumatic fatalities. In 2014, there were 1,000 fatal injuries on U.S. construction sites, among about 4,800 total traumatic injuries, traumatic fatalities that occurred across workplaces in the country. So again, between about 20 and 25% of those fatalities are people working on construction sites, laborers and so forth. When we look at those numbers a little more closely and break them down, what we see is, not surprisingly, there are large differences between the states. And looking particularly at California and Texas, very comparable construction workforces, almost exactly the same size. Between 2012 and 2014, each of those states put about 600,000 people to work in construction sites. Texas had twice the number of fatalities and continues to have twice the number of fatalities on construction work sites compared to California. So every 2.5 days, a construction worker dies on a construction site in Texas. We know from our health and safety experts that these are eminently preventable incidents. And it's really clear that labor policy decisions and labor enforcement actions have a huge effect on determining the working conditions in construction, including whether people come home at the end of the day or not. And so my hope here is that this discussion of as we're putting people to work and doing this much needed infrastructure work, that the discussions of those working conditions become part of the effort. I think many of you may have heard about 6 weeks ago in Boston's South End, the Atlantic Drain Company was replacing a water main on Dartmouth Street. They had 4 workers down in a 12-foot deep trench, about 20 feet long. Kevin Maddox was one of the workers, 53-year-old worker, been with that company for 18 years, had 3 kids. He was down there with Robert Higgins, who's 47, had just started working with that company. And they were in the bottom of an unshored trench, so meaning that the walls of that trench were not supported with steel or other kinds of construction members to keep them from collapsing. And for reasons that are still unclear, they breached the water main. And within seconds, that trench, the water cascaded up against the edges of the trench and brought down gravel and dirt that trapped these 2 workers in the bottom of the trench. The gravel and dirt covered their legs. They were unable to escape. And according to co-workers, they were trapped in the bottom of that trench where the water raised up 12 feet, reached the surface level, and they drowned. And co-workers trying to rescue them, as I said, this whole thing unfolded in a matter of seconds. Boston firefighters, after they finally shut off that main, were able to recover those people, working on their hands and knees, and they found them in a standing position at the bottom of that trench. And I'm saying this not to be over dramatic or what have you, but because the contractor that hired these workers, Atlantic Drain, was one of 12 companies in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that was designated by federal OSHA as a severe violator of worker health and safety regulations. And that means that that classification is reserved for recalcitrant employers that endanger workers by committing willful, repeat, or failure to abate violations. This company had been cited previously for trench shoring violations the year before. Federal OSHA had $100,000 in fines against this company, which had refused to pay those fines. Now, despite that, the history of these willful OSHA violations, unpaid fines, all of which are publicly available on the OSHA website, federal OSHA website. The city of Boston was continuing to issue permits to the contractor to conduct trench work throughout the city. And the company's owner continues to hold a state construction supervisor's license from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And so, so I asked the question, did this, why is this happening? Why are they being awarded contracts to do this work, public contracts? Are they competing against law-abiding contractors, undercutting those bids? We don't know at this point. The reporter I spoke with just said we don't know. What we do know is that the families of these two men are trying to put their lives back together. They went to work and they never came home. And so, what's going on now? So in Texas, we are seeing an incident of this type every 2.5 days in the construction industry. And when we look more closely at what's happening there, the Texas Observer did an investigation, and they concluded that the causes are far from mysterious. Lax enforcement of labor and safety regulations, too many overtime hours without rest breaks, a lack of safety training and equipment, and off-the-books employment. And when they looked closer, they found that there were a number of studies out showing that in Texas there were, last year, $7 billion in unreported wages annually. 50% of construction workers reported being denied overtime pay for overtime work. 70% reported receiving no health benefits, pensions, or other benefits. And the average under-the-table wage was $11.19. And the conclusion from the Texas Observer was that Texas has failed to guarantee even the most basic safety and labor protections. I would characterize this, and many others have, as a low-road route to employment. And it's juxtaposed against what has been happening in California, also a very large and robust construction industry that still saw 150 fatalities and still continues to see 150 every year, but half of what we're seeing in Texas. And what California has done is, one thing they have done is invested in the apprenticeship training world. So California invests about $300 million, which is then matched by employers in apprenticeship training for workers coming onto construction sites, doing pipe fitting, boiler making, iron work, all of the different building and construction trades. It's 6 times more than what is being invested in Texas. So $300 million in apprenticeship training in California, $50 million in Texas. You have untrained people coming onto these work sites in Texas. There are a number of the other things in California. It's fairly high union density, about 20% in the construction industry. So we see prevailing wage agreements, higher wage rates, benefit rates, and retirement programs for these workers, as well as a path to sort of long-term employment and careers. And the other thing, and I'll just finish up, that what California decided to do, it's like the state discovered that there was a very large underground economy in construction, particularly in residential construction, but also in some of these others where people are sort of picked up at Home Depot, they're brought here on this site, and they're left off at the end of the day. The state, several years ago, launched a labor enforcement task force made up of 9 different state agencies, including Cal OSHA, looking at health and safety violations and so forth, and wage theft being a huge problem. And that task force is robust. It's out working every day. And the question is California doing this because it's a big-hearted, generous government? Well, not exactly. I mean, when you go on the Labor Enforcement Task Force website, and I've worked with these folks, it's very clear that the mission is about protecting workers from the hazards of underground employment, and that they are denied correct wages for an honest day's work. They're put at risk in unsafe work environments, and they are excluded from social insurance programs like workers' comp, disability, and so forth. But then what it says is, law-abiding compliant businesses can't compete against those that have gained an unfair advantage by evading their legal employment responsibilities. And the state of California loses between $8 and $28 billion a year in tax revenues from companies that are paying people off the books, and they're avoiding income, insurance, and sales taxes, and so forth. So there's a bipartisan case to be made, if you will, for high road employment. Two things that we can do, I think, around in thinking about employment in infrastructure work, and whether it's replacing pipes, it's doing window replacement, and sort of basic trades work. One is that we support the contractors that are abiding by the health and safety, wage and hour regulations that are in our states and federally, and that are doing the best that they can to protect the safety and health of their workforce. And on the other side of that is that we bar participation by contractors who have a record of OSHA or EPA violations, or who have otherwise endangered the safety and health of their employees. So I guess I'll just finish by saying, that as we're thinking about the long term, the objective here, which is is really rebuilding our infrastructure and doing all this necessary work, that we also think about the conditions that are going to affect the people that are doing that work every day, the people that we're going to rely on, and make sure that we bring them home at the end of the day. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. We want to now engage with the whole room. So please give us your questions, and we'll take them simultaneously from the screen, and also raise your hand at any time there's people wandering around someplace with microphones. So we want to keep this as engaged as possible. So thank you, Mike. You gave us a very sobering perspective on worker safety, and I think also raised the very kind of done underground or under the table, and the risks associated with that. We know from the lead world that a lot of lead exposure comes from remodeling and renovation that is not done in compliance with the RPR, renovation and painting rule. Did I get that right? Yeah. I'm sorry. Okay, so our panel has given us a lot to think about with regard to lead and energy, the jobs potential, lead and aging in place, and making sure that there's opportunities for men and women returning from the work. So let's start with the first question to Rick. Is there an ROI specifically on window replacement?
That's return on investment.
Yes.
And the answer is that, of course, it's going to vary in different situations. The Remodeling Magazine annual survey routinely reports that window replacement has one of the highest returns compared to cost, but it still doesn't recover 100% of cost. And the way the question is asked is that if you do this window replacement upgrade and sell the house a year later, how much would it add to the value of the house? In the case of window replacement, it's been settling at around 85 to 90%. But the interesting thing about that survey is that The cost value comes from costing contractors that they have, you know, what would it cost to do this project? The value on resale comes from a survey of realtors where they describe the project. So the survey of realtors shouldn't have anything to do with how high or low the cost is in some respects. They're given a dollar value for what they think would add to the house. And in the Clearwind project, what we found is that the cost in a bulk purchase programmatic effort was, you know, 1/2 to maybe 2/3 of the retail cost routinely reported in a Remodeling magazine. So we could very likely be in a situation here where the window replacement cost in a programmatic effort with the bulk purchase price is fully recovered in terms of the market value increase in these homes, which is primarily associated with the energy savings that you get from the windows. And in that case, all of the lead poisoning prevention benefits are essentially free.
Great, thank you. I'm actually hoping there's a microphone. I'm going to call in my friends from Illinois. So I think that there are folks who are involved in making sure the Clearwind program got passed in the first place, and I think the woman responsible for that fabulous acronym is Anita Weinberg, but also Nick Pennup and Marty Klutz in Illinois helped make sure that happened, and of course Dave Jacobs did a fabulous job on the evaluation. I was actually, is Marty still there? There she is. Marty, do you feel like you can speak to whether or not this next question, do we see any evidence that the RPR rule is working and that the procedures are being followed?
Well, I don't know of any study that's trying to determine that. I can kind of answer to the opposite, that we know there's a lot of non-compliance with the rule. And I can tell you as somebody who directs enforcement, there for sure is not enough resources. And I think I mentioned this in the housing group. The rule was really developed with the idea that states would enforce it. It's pretty hard. We have 6 states in our region. It's pretty hard to get folks out to states outside like a 50-mile radius of our office. And so, unfortunately, a lot of states haven't assumed the program. We only have 1 state in our region, and just not enough resources. You know, it's I would say both the states and EPA are pretty much on the ropes for lead resources right now. Sorry.
Thanks. Okay,
I wish I could say something better.
Yeah, so something, a work in progress, something we need to follow up on. Although, Rick, you did say that the Clearwind study showed that it didn't matter if you were using a lead abatement contractor or a contractor who had been trained in, let's say, work practices, you got the same result, which is good to know.
In that study, yeah.
In that study. So now we're going to ask Dwayne. Many of us know about your workforce efforts on the ground. What infrastructure changes would you make to allow your work to propagate? And share thoughts about workforce talent and access.
Well, the first thing I would say is I would reference, in Memphis we've gotten about $23 million to do lead abatement, and we've trained about 400 people. And the city only knows of about 105 who are actually working in the field. So that's with the supervisor, that's with the contractor, the supervisor, and then the workers. And they're steadily getting the dollars, but they're not doing any sort of analysis or data collection to really determine how effective it is. I would say the second thing is we should interject workforce and talent into the mix when we're talking housing and hazards and health. And I'll be with Anthony and the folks in Dallas at National League of Cities next week, and if we were talking about taking all of that and looking at creating jobs at the same time that we're trying to solve social issues, and perhaps we could, you know, sort of bring them together and have a multitude of impact.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Rick, we'll go back to you. It's not only windows, apparently.
Well, this is certainly true. One of the things I wanted to emphasize is that you can't just replace windows. If there's any deteriorated paint that needs to be stabilized, you need to clean properly and test for lead dust. The question specifically, what about lead in door and floor trim. Well, the good news in a sense is that we know that pre-1940 homes, almost all of them have lead paint somewhere, or a huge percentage do. They don't all have lead dust hazards and deteriorated lead paint. And the windows seem to be the most problematic component in the house, I think in part because they use much higher levels of lead in exterior paint, and that got into the windows, essentially got that exterior lead paint in troughs, and that's one of the reasons they have such high lead levels. But the much bigger factor is that they are such a more consistent friction and impact situation, creating lead dust. So this would not be full abatement. I mean, I think that when you say full abatement, it terrifies homeowners and, you know, a lot of other people to do a surface-by-surface inspection, to know every place that there has been lead paint, and to encapsulate or remove that is a really daunting thing for us to be pushing. When you're saying window replacement and repainting, clean up the dust and test to make sure it's clean, that's something people can manage. They're getting a lot of other benefits. They might want to replace windows anyway. And again, we have this trend data that says, even though there might be some lead paint on a door or on trim here or there or on the exterior of the house, the window replacement and demolition trends have been accurately predicting the downward trend in elevated blood lead. So let's keep it up.
Great. I'm going to ask the audience that we got a comment that we've been really focusing on construction jobs, and we're not talking about jobs in early childhood education to help mitigate the effects of lead. I'm going to ask if there's anybody from the audience who'd like to speak to that, because I don't think any of us are no, we're all looking scared. We don't know how to respond to that. So if anybody wants to volunteer to ask to help illuminate us, that would be great. Next, I'd like to take the question: how can mom and pop multi-unit property owners maintain affordable housing? I'm assuming we're talking about naturally affordable housing here, so unsubsidized affordable housing options for residents without access to cost-effective repair options. Are there solutions that you can speak of? I'm happy to take that unless somebody else wants to. So this is this characterizes the housing stock we have in Chicago, and in many moderate and smaller sized cities across the country. How do you balance the needs to preserve affordable housing and the need to create healthy, safe, affordable housing? And I would say you can't have them be competitive. They have to be together. We have to be together with the affordable housing community, making sure that we're driving resources into preserving affordable, healthy, lead-safe housing. So we need to work on initiatives that work together. One fabulous way to do that is to take the very successful HUD lead hazard control and healthy homes programs and add a lot more zeros to their budget. I forget exactly, do we need $1 billion? So that's one very effective way to make sure that we have good programs out there with regard to how can you stretch the dollars so you can address more units. I'm actually hoping the next panel that's talking about financing will take that on and speak more eloquently than I can to it. But there's lots of, the affordable housing community has come up with a lot of ways to undertake moderate rehab over the years, from the energy side, from aging in place from just creating healthy, safe housing, and this is no different. It's not. I think Dave said this earlier today. We're talking about preserving our affordable housing stock, so you can do 50-50 programs. There's all sorts of different ways to stretch dollars, but I just want to make a strong plea for let's not pit affordable housing advocates against public health advocates. Let's come together as one.
I would add to that in terms of specific potential sources of funding, this was in the recommendations from Find It, Fix It, is that there are opportunities to better leverage money that is already going into weatherization. You can give some more flexibility to states in using a larger percentage of their low-income home energy assistance program funds for weatherization. They already used like 25% of it for that purpose now. And the problem is that when the weatherization people are told to only look at the payback in terms of energy savings, window replacement usually ranks lower than other things that they might do. But they don't count the lead poisoning prevention benefits, and there needs to be a way of coordinating those existing funding streams with the HUD grants better. So you need to communicate that you'd be providing services for a lot of things at once, and lowering energy costs through efficiency is certainly a part of affordable housing.
Great. So, Mike, I think we have a couple of questions headed your way. Hazard remediation work can be hazardous. Yes, it can. Any idea for protecting workers from occupational exposures?
Yeah, so I think it's useful to think about safety hazards and health hazards. Safety hazards being, falls off of ladders, off of roofs, trapped in a trench, struck by an object, electrocution. Whereas health hazards are, silica, lead, chemical exposures, and so forth. Hearing loss, pulmonary diseases that you see in construction. And so, the question is, any ideas for protecting workers from occupational exposures? One of the things that we've been doing in California is giving preference to employers, to contractors who can demonstrate that they have a functioning, what we call injury and illness prevention program. It's like, we all know, everyone understands how you protect people on the job. This is not new. We know how to protect workers from falls. We know how to do respiratory protection. We know how to do engineering controls to abate dust before it's emitted. And the question is, how do you get contractors to do those things, and how do you get workers to comply with the things that their contractors are trying to get them to do on the job? I think specifically to the question where contractors understand that their health and safety program and the efficacy of their program is going to be part of their bid in getting that work, it changes the dynamic. Where if that's not part of the formula, where you have employers who feel free to hire, to do underground cash pay, if you will, not pay workers' compensation and do the other kinds of underground employment kinds of activities, that is the place where workers are the greatest at risk, and both for health exposures, but then for the safety hazards that can be so costly in terms of injuries and potentially for fatalities.
Great. Sam, we got a couple of questions headed your way. One is, I know you encounter this every day in your work, that the population you're advocating for is not allowed to participate in so many training opportunities and workforce opportunities. Specifically, there's this issue of working in child-occupied facilities. Do you have thoughts on that?
I do. Yeah.
Great.
And I think it's really unfortunate because we're in a moment where I think huge sections of this country, the plurality, majority, in fact, has come to understand that over-incarcerating men, women has a human toll. There's 6 to 7 million children with a parent in the criminal justice system. They are 5 or 6 times more likely themselves to end up in the criminal justice system themselves. This all comes at a cost of $82 billion a year. And so the human cost, the financial cost, $82 billion.
Wow, could we just redirect a little of that to...
And so, yeah, we would love to have reentry be so successful that those funds are in fact dedicated on things we actually have to spend money on. And the Obama administration has been a leader in, what they call, is now referred to as fair chance hiring, but what was called previously ban the box, limiting this question of whether someone had a conviction on the original job application and saving it for a follow-up interview perhaps when the job was offered. And so, these HUD regulations to me fly in the face of that ethos, of that progress. Yes, there are certain situations, someone who has maybe multiple felony charges for home invasion might not be the first person that we want on these job sites. But I think to these sort of vast, broad, exclusionary bans of people with felonies out of any occupation, I think flies in the face of what the zeitgeist is right now, flies in the face of what the evidence is on what a well-supervised work crew can do successfully, and just simply should be reconsidered. It's something that, in the remaining 45 days of this administration, I think the Reentry Council, which is this interagency group that includes HUD, should address.
Thanks. And as a follow-up, who have been your best partners?
So, again, I didn't want to layer on too many of the sort of challenges that our work faces for sort of fear of scaring people off of trying to engage the formerly incarcerated, but these sort of astronomic recidivism rates of 70% or so over 5 years, and that's because of the multitude of barriers that people face, right? From limited education levels to finding safe and affordable housing, to mental health, to access to healthcare. And so the partners for this work really have to be the community partners who address all of these needs, right? And so the CEO focuses on employment. We use that as a connection, not just to a job, but a connection to civic life, right? Getting someone to be a member of their community in a different way. But it does require us, just as a single issue organization, to engage with organizations that offer counseling, organizations that offer housing, community college networks and systems that will offer the training that allows someone to not just get that first job, but then ultimately to move up in the labor force. Employers are absolutely key. I mean, at a time when unemployment at 4.9% means some in certain cities are struggling to find the right and more highly skilled employees, trying to bring them into the fold in a network of community providers, I think is really important. And it's frequently philanthropy, right, who's helping bring together. I mean, I have to recognize the Community Foundation of Greater Buffalo. I mean, their work in this space is what drew CEO in. I don't think we would have been able to sort of put our blinders down long enough to see this opportunity that maybe CEO and participants aren't going to immediately be doing the really skilled work and the dangerous work in lead abatement, but they could be, right, with the right set of training, with the right stackable credentials earned, with the right support. So it's those types of partners that are key for convening and for execution.
Great, thank you. So I also wanted to ask everyone on the panel to talk a little bit more about opportunities with the manufacturing sector. I know none of us necessarily represents the manufacturing sector, but I think that, Rick, you touched on this a little bit with engaging with window manufacturers because they're good windows, they're American-made windows.
Yeah.
How can we close the circle more on that?
We had limited success with a project to promote lead-safe window replacement that was funded by the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. That we did a fair amount of outreach and education. There were still a number of window manufacturers who we were hearing about going and complaining about, the RFP rule. I mean, it was like they just couldn't get it. But there were others who actually launched an ad campaign, a public interest campaign to promote that you need to replace your, they figured out that this was something that they should be helping to promote and making people aware of, that this was a hazard. I should also note that when I talk about the job creation in the window manufacturing, that's just the first layer. They, of course, are getting materials from other suppliers, so there would be a multiplier effect associated with industrial production.
Great, thank you. Mike, did you want to talk about this as well?
You mean about sort of sourcing materials and so forth?
Yeah.
I'm going to defer to Sam.
I'm going to defer to Sam.
Yeah. You defer to the audience.
Great.
Well, I do know that we built the Bay Bridge in San Francisco Bay Area with Chinese-made steel, shipped it in pre-manufactured underneath the Golden Gate Bridge. We have a burgeoning manufacturing sector, and I have very little understanding of how the trade impacts and trade restrictions apply in these kinds of cases. But where most of our manufacturers are small companies, they have 20 and fewer people, the extent that we can drive purchasing from those companies, that has a multiplier effect. I think we've seen that for decades.
Great. And then also for Mike, does a job have to be union to be high road?
It's a really great question, and I come out of the labor movement. I was a fire paramedic in the emergency services for 13 years. I was a union officer and a union organizer, and there is a huge difference between having a workforce that is represented and is able to engage across the table with an employer on wages, hours, working conditions, health and safety. In the firefighters world, it was the union that drove all of the health and safety issues that we were facing. The city was mostly worried about production, getting calls answered, 911, you're out there in so many minutes, you're cleared, ready for the next one. We were worried about safety on the fire ground, bloodborne pathogens, diesel exhaust, all of the things that protect the people on the job. In the U.S., right now we're down to about 6.5% in the private sector that's unionized. It's about 12% when you add government, public sector. So most of this work, I think we can assume most of it is going to be non-union work. California's residential construction is mostly non-union. But I think there are things that we can do that make a big difference for non-union contractors who are applying for these monies, for public monies to do infrastructure work. That if we are stipulating that those contractors, as I said, can demonstrate that they have a functioning safety and health program, they can demonstrate a record of sort of commitment to protecting their workforce over time, and that's part of the bidding process, that can go a long way. And it doesn't depend on having an organized workforce or sort of barring employers who are not unionized. We get all kinds of trouble there. But we can put requirements on contractors who are seeking these monies and seeking this work. And I think we should.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So Sam, are you ready to close it out? I'm going to ask you.
Sure.
I'm going to ask you. What's the role that community colleges should play in training, or could they play in training and certifying workers?
I'm spending the part of these 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, at the Department of Education. Got invited several months ago to meet with and be a coach for 9 grantees who are doing career technical education in jails and prisons around the country. And a community college is at the center of each of these projects. And it's so exciting because the community college has that knowledge of the local employer base. They have that connection to people inside, and they're acting as that nexus. And I see them playing just a hugely important role in initiatives like this. I mean, trying to wrangle together the 75,000 jobs that are done safely with the providers who are doing them. You can see community foundations and community colleges playing that key link. And if you're going to add in the formerly incarcerated, doing the in-reach, going behind the walls, being able then to get people certified so they can work safely, but also skilled up to what the contractors are saying need to be done. I mean, that's where I've seen the responsivity of community colleges to be so impactful, to say, yes, we know that there's this 50-hour training that's sort of industry recognized, and we'll get a certification, but I need this very specific thing because we're working in this community that has, 7 different, additional requirements. It's not going to take a month to teach you, but the community college knows that they have to represent this employer need. So I think when we're talking about who, in fact, is the nexus, and in fact, I think could be community colleges for this work.
Great. Well, thank you all for your both very inspiring and very sobering words. Let's thank the whole group.